Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have a wonderful crowd here today, which is an indication of the interest in our speaker today. Welcome to the Library of Virginia. I'm Conley Edwards. I'm the state archivist here at the library and one of the division directors. Today is certainly a special day for several reasons. Today's presentation is one of several events here in Richmond that marks Archives Month in the Commonwealth. I hope perhaps you all have seen this wonderful poster that staff here and at other institutions have created to mark Archives Month. The month is marked by a proclamation from Governor Tim Kaine, and it celebrates those institutions and individuals in our communities who work hard to preserve the documentary heritage of Virginia. Governor Kaine has encouraged Virginia citizens to become more familiar with those institutions throughout this year. As the custodian of over 110 million manuscript items related to Virginia from its earliest days to the present, the Library of Virginia welcomes you at any time to come and use the collections here. Today's topic is the noted Virginian George Wythe. It's a pleasure to welcome students from George Wythe High School here in Richmond today. I hope that you all that are here I hope that you will tell your classmates about the library and what you hear and see today. Today is also a special day because Bruce Chadwick is here to talk about his book, I Am Murdered, George Wythe, Thomas Jefferson, and the Killing That Shocked the Nation. Bruce has been a full-time journalist for the New York Daily News, a later-in-life student working on a PhD in history from Rutgers University, where he now lectures in American history, and is currently a faculty member at New Jersey City University teaching journalism. He is the author of 28 books. The latest was released just 3 months after the release of I Am Murdered. How do authors find the inspiration for their subjects and stories? Sometimes ideas just fall out of the sky and hit you on the head. And I'll let Bruce relate how he was inspired to write this fascinating book that involves a teacher and his exceptional student, family relationships, a murder mystery, and the trial of a century. In this case, the early 19th century. Reviewers have described I Am Murdered as part American tragedy and part CSI Richmond, circa 1806. Welcome to the library, Bruce. We're glad to have you to speak, and as part of the Noontime series here, especially during the celebration of Archives Month.
Can you all hear me okay with this mic on? Okay. I look all right? Let me tell you a story. We're staying at the Hilton Gardens Hotel across the street, my wife and I. And 9:30 this morning, we decided we're going to go swimming in the pool. So I've got my fire engine red bathing suit on, my worn out sneakers, and an amusement park t-shirt. The fire alarm goes off. Everybody has to vacate the hotel. All the bomb, PA announcements, get out of the hotel, it's an emergency. And I said to myself, I've got to talk here at noontime today. I can't get back to my room. So I'm going to appear there in my red swim trunks, and my hair was sticking up in the air. So, better this. He was telling the story about the book hitting me in the head. Most people, when they talk to historians, meet historians, they assume that the ideas that you had for books came from research far in the back waters of archives or historical symposiums, things that you researched for years, from colloquies with other professors. This idea literally hit me in the head. I was at a library at Rutgers University, and I lost my balance, and I brushed against a bookshelf, and 2 shelves up, a book fell out, plunged through the air, and whacked me in the head. Fell to the ground, the top of the book opened, and it said, The Murder of George Wythe. And I said, whoa! Now, I knew who George Wythe was, but I did not know that he had been murdered, as most people do not. So that's what prompted me to go into the research on this book. Now, when I came here today, I brought my trusty notes with me. A couple pages of notes. I don't know why I did, because most of them are written in my handwriting, which is not readable. I have the worst handwriting in the world. Now, you may think you do, or someone in your family does. No, I do. Had it all my life. Now, I went to a Catholic grade school in New Jersey, and handwriting was a core course. You had to take it for years. Millions of O's and M's. Whenever you go anywhere in the world, you'll know somebody's Catholic. They have great handwriting. In the 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church, I'm the only person that ever flunked handwriting. It's so bad that when my wife and I go visiting and I have directions scrawled down for somebody how to get there, I'll turn to her and I'll give her the directions. She'll be reading them and I'll say, "You have them upside down." And she'll say, "It's easier to read this way." My handwriting was so bad I would flunk every single year. And the nuns who ran the school would be on my mother all the time. You've got to do something with this kid. So my mother would work with me for hours on my penmanship. Day after day, month after month, year after year. And the more we worked on it, the worse it got. And she was just distraught. So one day, after a couple of years of this, I come home, and she's sitting there with a big smile on her face. I said, "What are you so happy about?" So I just got back from the beauty parlor. At the beauty parlor, I was reading Reader's Digest magazine. Now, this is the Bible of American journalism. In Reader's Digest, there was a story about a Harvard University study. Harvard University. And the study showed that young boys, 10 or 11 years old, who have bad penmanship, it's a sign of future genius. Don't worry about it. So we didn't. We stopped all the studying and handwriting and never thought about it again. Now, 40 years later, at my 50th birthday party, and my mother's had too much wine, she sits down next to me in slurring words, says, "Do you remember when you were a kid and that thing about all the handwriting and the Reader's Digest and the Harvard University study?" I said, yeah, I remember that. She looked at me, she paused, and she said, "I made it up." She was feeling so bad, I just made it up. And I said, "It's all right, Mom. I realized long ago I wasn't a genius." Anyway, on to George Wythe. It's very interesting. You know, all of you here in Virginia are very familiar with Chancellor Wythe. There's counties, towns. There's a street a couple blocks from here named after George Wythe. But because he never left the diary or journals or wrote a book about himself, as just about everybody in that era did, outside of Virginia, he's not a well-known guy. And I knew a little bit about him, but not much, when this book fell and hit me in the head. And here's what happened to him. On Sunday, May 25th, he woke up at about 5 a.m., as he always did, at his house on Grace and 5th Street, at that intersection over that way. On his back porch, he had installed a shower. It was a big bucket of ice-cold water that was out of his well. And pulled the thing, and the bucket drenched him, soaked himself up, and went up to his bedroom to read the morning newspapers. He did this every single morning of his life. It was a ritual. Shortly after that, his servant and cook, a freed woman named Lydia Broadnax, arrived to make breakfast. Also living in his house was his great-nephew, George Wythe Sweeney, his sister's grandson. George Wythe Sweeney was the black sheep of the family. You all know a George Wythe Sweeney. Everybody in the family is hardworking and responsible. And then there's a George Wythe Sweeney. Irresponsible, wild, no direction in life. So his sister asked him if George Wythe could live with him, so the old man could straighten him out, introduce him to the proper people, get him an education. And he said he would do that, but he had his hands full with this kid. The kid was 17. Also living in the house was a mulatto teenager named Michael Brown. I'll explain to you later, but George Wythe all his life took in smart teenage boys and tutored them personally to give them a leg up in life. So Michael Brown and George Wythe Sweeney are with Lydia in the kitchen, and George Wythe is upstairs. Lydia's making breakfast. She's making toast and buttering it. And she notices out of the corner of her eye that George Wythe Sweeney goes over, pours himself a cup of coffee, starts to drink it, and is chit-chatting with her. So they can only have a piece of toast today because I've got to go. I've got to get out of here. I've got to get somewhere. She goes back to buttering her toast. He puts his coffee down. And he takes a small piece of paper out of his pocket. He puts it over the coffee pot and dumps a bunch of white plastic grinds into the coffee pot. Quickly takes the paper, throws it in the fire underneath to destroy the evidence. She sees him do this. She sees him do this out of a corner of rock, but she doesn't think anything of it. Why would you? He leaves. She has coffee, Michael Brown has coffee, and George Wythe has coffee upstairs. About 15 minutes after drinking his coffee, George Wythe vomits violently. He feels very, very shaky and weak, blurry eyesight. Gets up, gets to the staircase of his house, and holds onto the banister, gets down, goes across the arch where the kitchen is, finds Lydia. Lydia is leaning against the counter like this, with one hand on the counter and one hand holding her stomach. That is in upheaval. She feels terrible. Michael Brown, his protege, is sitting down at the table, spread-eagled on the table like this, and they're all groaning. George Wythe says to Lydia, get a doctor. Get a doctor fast. We're in trouble. She does. She gets somebody to find a doctor that lives nearby. Doctor comes over. Doctor goes up to George Wythe's bedroom. Wythe is lying in bed. He's propped up on his elbows, leaning back against a pillow. And in a very guttural voice, says to his doctor, I am murdered. That kicked off the great homicide investigation of the early part of the 19th century. When Wythe died, it was the death of one of the most venerated men in the history of Richmond and Virginia and in the United States. He had been a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a delegate of the Constitutional Convention, fought for one day in the Revolutionary War, and was a long-time esteemed judge here in Virginia, sitting in Richmond, of the Chancery or Civil Court. The town shut down for his funeral. He lay in wait at the state capitol rotunda, and his funeral went down the hill to Main Street along the river, then along Main Street to St. John's Church, where he was buried. In the same church where he sat and heard Patrick Henry give his famous speech that ended, give me liberty or give me death. Why was this guy as beloved as he was? I want to backtrack about that and tell you a little bit about his life. This is a portrait done of him when he was in his late 40s. He was married to a woman in his early 20s. She died a year later. He moved to Williamsburg. He graduated from law school at the age of 18. Went to Williamsburg to be a lawyer. At Williamsburg, he got involved in politics, higher education, and met his second wife, a woman named Elizabeth Talaferro. Her dad was a wealthy merchant in Virginia at that time. Now, hang on, I'm going to try and operate this gizmo here. I think that only nuclear physicists and 8-year-old kids can do this. It worked. These are drawings of William and Mary College at that time, around 1800, 1790, where Wythe was a professor. Later, Thomas Jefferson made him America's first law professor, teaching there at William and Mary College. This is the home that he lived in Williamsburg. It's still there. If any of you have been to Williamsburg, it's one of the stops on the tour, the historical tour. It's a 4,000 square foot house. It's big today, and it was colossal for its era in the 1760s in Virginia. Now, behind the house, there are grounds. This is a picture of it today from the sky. There are grounds, and you can see the outbuildings in back. These were like his kitchen, blacksmith shop, his horses' stables, and cabins for the slaves that were his for a while to live in. This is his study. Now, when Wythe was at William and Mary, he took classes, but the thing he really enjoyed the most were his proteges, his academic proteges. He and his wife could not have children. So what they did was, over the years, over 35 years before she died, every year they had several students who lived with them in their house, lived there, and he tutored them personally to make them better students. Then there were 10 or 11 students from the university who didn't live there, but came to see him for tutoring every day. This was in addition to all the regular studies at college. Now, later on, I forget who it was, an American educational expert in the 1750s, said that the personal studies that these people did with were better than an Ivy League education today. And in addition to that, they also went to school at William and Mary. Among the people that were his students were several people who later became the governor of Virginia. One of them was John Marshall, one of the first Chief Justices of the United States Supreme Court. And that era, he asked people to keep notebooks of his studies. Everybody kept a notebook that was about 35, 40 pages. Marshall's was 256 pages. And in the margins of just about every page, he was hopelessly in love with a woman named Polly Ambler, who he later married. In the margin of just about every page in his notebook, it says in big letters, "I love Polly Ambler." It was just God. Several governors, U.S. senators, representatives, presidents of colleges, they were all his proteges. And the only thing that he worried about this was this. Wythe was a brilliant guy. He read or spoke in 5 different languages. He was smart. And all these people that he tutored, they were smart, but there was nobody like him. And he always wondered if he could ever meet somebody as smart as he was. Then one day, he met a 16-year-old freshman, tall, thin, red-headed kid carrying a violin under his elbow. The kid's name was Thomas Jefferson. He became his protege. Jefferson and Wythe were like this. They said that no two people in the colonial era thought alike as these two guys. And it wasn't just politics. Wythe loved gardening. Jefferson loved gardening. Wythe loved reading books. Jefferson loved reading books. Jefferson loved reading books so much that he had 6,500 books that he donated to the government, and they became the basis for the Library of Congress. Wythe had almost as many books. They would mail books back and forth to each other when they were adults. They would mail strains of grass and cuts of trees to each other for planting. They both loved languages. They both spoke and read many different languages. They both had odd habits, too. Jefferson, Wythe believed in getting up at 5 a.m. and taking cold showers while it was still dark. Jefferson's idea of a good time was to get up at 5 a.m. and stick his bare feet into a tub of freezing cold water. That would wake him up for the day. I don't know about you, when I get up at 5 o'clock, I turn on television. So the two of them become very, very close. Now what Wythe does as professor of law, he invents the moot court. He invented it. You all know what the moot court is. It's where all of us are students, and we pretend we're in court. Some of you are the defense, some of you are the prosecutions, some of you are witnesses. And we redo a trial or a fictional trial to see how it plays out, to make ourselves better lawyers. He invented that, and he invented the moot legislature. Same purpose for his political students. Held the moot legislature in the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg, which is the state capital. People got on-the-job training, and in each instance, Wythe was the judge in the court or the Speaker of the House in the legislature. All this is very, very successful. When the war breaks out, Wythe is a very successful guy. He had a long-time marriage, although they didn't have children. He had become a successful lawyer. He became the mayor of Williamsburg after a term on the city council. He was a member of the state legislature for many years, and for 1 year, the Speaker of the House. Now, when the war starts, he tries to sign up for the Revolutionary Army. He's about 52 years old at the time. Now, you got to remember, in that era in America, about 3/4 of folks died before the age of 50. If you lived into your 60s, you were considered ancient. And to live into your 80s, it seemed to be like Roman togas. He went down to register 52 and he said, "Old man, what are you doing here? This is, the average age in the Army is 18 years, 6 months. What are you doing here?" He said, "I want to join the Army. I want to fight the British." They sent him home. A couple months later, he and two friends are hunting, and they come upon an area near the water, and they see 7 or 8 British soldiers get off a ship and start walking down the road. And Wythe runs to the edge of the woods where they're at, aims his rifle and fires at them. Doesn't come anywhere close to hitting them. And told his friends, he said, "Well, I was in the war for 1 day. I showed him." Now, he signs the Declaration of Independence. He helps Thomas Jefferson write the Declaration of Independence. It's an interesting exhibit. 5 or 6 guys on a committee with Jefferson to write the Declaration. And they all gave like sample drafts. And they're very good, but they're like flat. And then when you read his version, well, He, in the Revolution, comes back with Jefferson to Virginia. They're asked to write the new laws for the state, now that America is going to be a country. And they revise all the laws of Virginia. They keep the slave laws in place as they were. But they ask for leniency in murder cases because too many people are being executed. Call for murder in only about 10 instances instead of all the different murder hanging verdicts you could get throughout the country. As an example, in Maryland, if you stole $5 from this gentleman, they would hang you in Maryland for stealing $5. In many of the states, if this gentleman here, if you stole firewood because you were freezing from her barn next door, they would hang you for that. In England at this time, they had what was called the Bloody Code, 212 offenses for which you could be hanged. Well, Wythe and Jefferson eliminated all this and just cut it down to basically rape, murder, and then put in 2 degrees of murder, premeditated murder and manslaughter. They go for general public education. But they left the slave laws alone, which were quite harsh at the time. He leaves Williamsburg in the late 1780s, when the capital moves to Richmond, here. Williamsburg becomes a post town. All his friends have moved to Richmond. He doesn't get a lot of top students like he used to because there's more and more colonies in America. And first and foremost, his wife died. And he's lost without her, just lost. He had the job as the head of the civil courts in Virginia, the High Chancellor. So he decides he'll move to Richmond and run the courts from there. And he does. Lydia Broadnax, his freed woman servant, goes with him. He frees all the slaves that work for him in Williamsburg, and he sells off the plantation he owned in Chesterville, 30 miles away. And the slaves with him. So he has no more slaves in his life. He's always been opposed to slavery. As Jefferson was, Jefferson never let go of his slaves. He goes to Virginia, to Richmond, Virginia, to start a new and final life at the age of he's about 64 at this time. Gets to Virginia, buys a house at the corner of 5th and Gray Street, elegant house. Holds his court sessions, starts up a book club, joins different literary societies, attends different parties and receptions, and has a very enjoyable life. He liked moving to Richmond, it was a good idea. But he never thought for a minute that he'd be murdered there. Now, this picture here is the study of Wythe's house, where he worked with Jefferson and his protégés. About 12 by 14 with a 12-foot high ceiling. This is the state capitol, where he conducted his moot courts and served as a state legislature. That's there today, too, in Williamsburg. This is the Rolling Tavern. If you've ever been to Williamsburg, you've heard this story. Whenever the governor would close down the state legislature when they're getting too radical before the war, they would reconnoiter here at Rolling Tavern. And they would give a lot of speeches, pass a lot of bills, and drink a lot of beer. This is a plan of Williamsburg. I don't know one of those pointer things, but Wythe's house is right up around here. And the governor's mansion is up on top, and the state capitol is down on this end. It's a city of about 4,000 people at the time. This is John Marshall, who was one of his students that I told you about with his billboard. And this, of course, is Jefferson when he's the president. And this is Richmond in 1806. You can see Manchester Island is here, town of Manchester. There's the bridge into Richmond, and then here is the new state capitol building, designed and built by Thomas Jefferson on top of the hill where we are now. And just off here, right about here, is where George Wythe lived. He could walk 3 blocks to the state capitol building and conduct his court sessions. Now, after he was poisoned, he summoned his 3 doctors who were taking care of him. Dr. James McClure, Dr. James McCall, and William Fouché. They were 3 of the best doctors in Richmond, 3 of the best doctors in the state, in the country. McClure was considered one of the best doctors in the world. They came to see him, and they looked at him, and he said, I've been murdered. He said, my nephew poisoned me. And Lydia Broadnax, his servant, would tell everybody who came that story. I saw him put the poison in the cup. We all drank it. We all got sick. He did it. They looked at Wythe, they examined him, they said, you've got cholera. Nobody murdered you. You have cholera. You have all the symptoms of cholera. Cholera in that area started in warm weather tropical climates. We're in Virginia at the start of the summertime. Cholera started with tainted water. Virginia's James River flooded and flooded out Main Street, and it was muddy and tainted. Cholera produced a whitish hue on places. They had whitish hue on strawberries in his house. He looked like people who had cholera. They were, they said, cadaverized. If you had cholera, you died in 2 days. They said, you've got cholera. We know. We're the experts. We're the best doctors, right? And they had become famous for epidemics, the three of them. Now, McClure, James McClure, he went to the University of Edinburgh, all three did. At the time, the finest medical school in the world. They studied anatomy there, the dissection of bodies, how to do an autopsy, among other things. McClure was one of their best students. He wrote a book. Few people in that era wrote books. He wrote a book on stomach bile that was reproduced in several languages. Got a fellowship to set up a practice in London, and then in Paris. He was the toast of 2 continents. He came to America to be a smallpox expert and stayed here. He treated people who were victims of the smallpox, yellow fever epidemics, swept through Virginia in that era. Heroic guy charged into towns when everybody else was fleeing them from the smallpox to save people. Inoculated thousands of people, the poor be inoculated for nothing, and slaves for nothing. James McCall, the same thing. McCall would found a medical family that was among Virginia's top medical families until the Civil War. Dr. Fouché, the third doctor, was Richmond's first mayor, a politician like McClure. McClure was the mayor of Richmond. Then he was a city councilman for a dozen years. He was a founding father, delegate at the Constitutional Convention. Twice, he almost became the Secretary of State, in addition to being a great doctor. Dr. William Fouché was the mayor of Richmond, served on the city council for years, state government, made a lot of money as a doctor. He owned 3 city blocks that he turned into a botanical gardens, one of the most beautiful in America. When the first Bank of Virginia set up an office in Richmond, they announced they were looking for the biggest building in town to convert to a bank. The biggest building in town, it was Fouché's house. So they bought his house. These guys were crackerjacks, public officials, and doctors. But he didn't have cholera. He stayed alive for 3, 4, 5 days. He didn't have cholera. Well, then what? He said, you got to check the nephew's room. There's arsenic there. And there was. There was a vial of arsenic. And the nephew said, so what? Everybody has arsenic. They did. At that time in America's cities, there were infestations of rats. It's a big thing in Europe with bubonic plague and other plagues in the Middle Ages. Fleas carried it in the skin of rats. When the rats would go on ships from city to city, and millions of people got infected. So around 1600, they invented a rat poison called ratsbane. And anybody could get it. You couldn't go in and buy it. You had to have somebody write you a note saying, we have a lot of rats in the house. Give them ratsbane. And everybody did. Everybody used ratsbane to kill rats. Now, the double edge of this sword is they could use it to kill people too. And that's what people did. The beauty of ratsbane and all arsenics is that there's no smell or taste or appearance to it. If you put it in somebody's glass of wine, there's a little bit of a sweet taste, but nothing else. Very few tests to say for sure around 1600 that somebody had murdered somebody with arsenic. Well, there were later on. So the kids said, I had ratsbane, so what? The days go by. 1 week later, Michael Brown dies. They do an autopsy. 2 weeks later, Judge Wythe dies, and they do an autopsy. Now, the doctors tell everybody he didn't have arsenic because people who get arsenic generally die within 2 to 4 days. There was something else. He's 80 years old. He's had a lot of problems. We don't know, but we'll do an autopsy and we'll cure him. Now, this time, 2 days after the judge's poison, the nephew, George Wythe, who had double-checked his will the night before he poisoned him to make sure he was in the will to get half of his estate. Now, we're talking with his old plantation, his mansion in Richmond, land that he owned. In today's money, $8 or $9 million. It's a lot of money. The kid would get half of it. The other half would go to the protege, Michael Brown. And if Michael Brown died, all of it would go to George Wythe. Now, Mayor Duval, I'll show you this picture later, knew this. He knew it. He knew Sweeney was going to get all this money. He goes to the police and says, here's your motive right here. Sweeney is arrested because 2 days after the judge was poisoned, he goes to a bank with a forged note to get $100. It's the 7th time he's visited the bank with forged notes because the kid is a hopeless gambler. Richmond was awash with gambling problems at that time. Kid owed a lot of money. So what he started to do was steal books and artifacts from his uncle's house, sell them, pay off his debts. But that wasn't enough. He forged checks at the bank. He forged this check and he gets arrested for forgery. So for sure they got him on forgery, they put him in jail. When Wythe dies, the kid is charged with murder. Everybody is convinced the kid is guilty. When the newspapers start writing stories, people come forward. A friend of his named Taylor Williams comes forward and says, he used to talk to me about how do you make arsenic. And he decided it was too difficult to make on his own. So he'd say, well, how do you buy arsenic? How do you get a hold of ratsbane? How can you get somebody to write a letter for you to do that? What's the best way to hide arsenic in your house? And his friend said, I gave it no thought. So what? It didn't mean anything to me, but I'm just telling you, this is what he was thinking about a week or so before the judge was poisoned. Carpenters come forward. Carpenters say, yeah, a week before the judge was poisoned, we had rented a shed in the judge's lot. And while we were working there, these are slave carpenters. While we were working there, the kid came in and started with shaving down like white minerals. And he said, you know what I'm doing? We said, yeah, you're making poison. You're shaving down a mineral that converts to arsenic. You're making poison because you have rats. And he just smiled at them and walked away. When he went to jail, he had a large packet of stuff in his hands. The jail warden frisked him down, saw the packet, and said, what's that? He said, oh, it's a roll of coins. He said, okay. The warden thought he'd be bailed out right away. Doesn't look at the roll of coins. An hour later, the kid is allowed to go out to the outdoor courtyard of the jail for exercise. On the other side of the courtyard is a slave girl named Phoebe. The warden of the jail lives on the other side of the courtyard. He has a garden. Phoebe's in the garden, and all of a sudden this white package comes flying over the wall, hits rose bushes. The thorns cut it open, and out pours huge, grainy, white substance. She goes and gets the warden. She says, I think it's arsenic. I've seen arsenic. I think it's arsenic. The Mayor Duval, comes over and tests it. Is it a taste test? He said, it's arsenic. Who threw it over? George Wythe Sweeney threw it over. Did you throw this over? Yeah. It's ratsbane. It's nothing. I just had it in my pocket, got it out, and I threw it over the wall. It's no big deal. No. Well, couldn't it be arsenic you poisoned your uncle with? No, I didn't do that. I didn't poison my uncle. He stays in jail. The judge dies, he's charged with murder. Everybody thinks he's guilty. This is another map of Richmond at the time. Up on top here is the Capitol, and where Wythe lived. On the far left over here is where the city jail was. Now, Richmond is a haven for crime in 1806. And today, I left the hotel today to pick up today's newspaper. Today's newspaper, the Richmond Times-Dispatch. If you saw it this morning, here it is, the front page. Singer's ex-wife says she was, Sniper's ex-wife says she was targeted of a murder. Today. Now, if you think there's a lot of crime in Richmond today, which there is, you should have been here in 1806. Richmond was an exploding city at the turn of the century. Became the state capital. Everybody descended upon it for business, to live, farming, merchants, workers, etc. Became a huge river port city for ocean-bound vessels. A lot of people came. It was the only city in the United States in which white Americans were a minority. They had high slave population. both a high immigrant population, people coming here with ships from the Caribbean and Europe and staying and living. Huge warehouses were converted into apartment houses where all these people lived in an integrated manner together. There were dozens of bars in Richmond where people went in an integrated fashion because there's so many different people here that nobody cared about black-white differences. All these people were too much for the town to handle. Today, if Richmond doubled in size, the infrastructure and city council of the city would make sure that the growth was controlled. In 1806, it was not controlled. There were no checks on anything. So you had too many people in a town that had too much money, and you had a lot of problems. In 1804 to 1806, the crime rate quadrupled. Quadrupled. There were 900 assaults a week in Richmond, a city that had 10,000 people. In the next 10 years, the size of the town doubled, and the 10 years of that, quadrupled. There were no professional policemen, just amateur watchmen. The murder rate was so high that a permanent gallows was built in town, and a city jail, and in addition to that, a state penitentiary was built in town. The crime rate in Richmond in 1806 did not count domestic crime or crimes committed against or by slaves. It didn't count bar fight crimes, crimes of one man against each other. Not counting, if you counted all those today, as they are in today's crime rate, the crime rate in Richmond in 1806 was twice what it is today. Twice. The problems in 1806 Richmond, prostitution. Prostitution was legal in most places in the United States. There were over 50 houses of prostitution in Richmond where people lost their money rather quickly. Drinking. There was over 200 drinking establishments in a town of 10,000 people. They were all problematic. And then there was gambling. Gambling at the hotels and in casinos that were built by the riverfront. Now the biggest gambling game of all, if any of you have been to Vegas or Atlantic City, there's a wheel called the Big Six. It's a huge wheel that has 36 different slots. And you bet which number is going to win. Now, the odds for you winning are 1 in 36. They're not very good. And everybody bets this wheel. Everybody spends money on this wheel because gamblers are stupid. Well, let's not go there. Everybody did that in 1806, and people with this wheel had all this money. This is how George Wythe gets sucked into gambling and crime, by hanging out in these bad areas. 17-year-old kid. In 1833, there's a state commission on crime that targets the gambling, prostitution, and the taverns as the cause of it, especially among young men, especially among young men from wealthy families that steal to get money or forge things, just like George Wythe. So those are the problems that are involved in this. This is Jefferson State House. This is William Worth. We're going to get back to him in a minute. This is Henry Clay. Henry Clay, one of the greatest politicians in this country's history, was George Wythe's protege when he got to Richmond. He tried as hard as he could to get Henry Clay to learn how to read and speak Greek and Latin. And Clay could not. And just threw up his hands at the chancellor. He said, I just can't. So Wythe said, well, try and memorize it. So he memorized stuff. He memorized whole acts of plays by Sophocles and Euripides. He memorized like chapters in books by Julius Caesar in Latin. And later, when he became Speaker of the House and the man ran for president 3 times, he would go to parties in Europe or here in the U.S. and at whim just spew out a chapter of Latin or an act of a play. And people would say, how do you do that? He says, it was easy. George Wythe taught me how to do that. And Henry Clay went into deep mourning when he found out that Wythe had died. This is Edmund Randolph. Now, who's going to represent the kid? Nobody. Nobody would touch it. Everybody did investigations. All the investigation showed he did it. The eyewitness, Lydia Broadnax, saw him pour the poison into the kettle. The girl next door to the jail saw him throw the arsenic over the wall. The guys in the carpentry shop saw him make the arsenic. His own best friend put the finger on him, talking about how to get arsenic. Nobody would have done that. They have to get a pro bono lawyer. The pro bono lawyer said, oh God, not me, because you can't win the case, and you look bad, and my God, your client murdered the most beloved person in the state of Virginia. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, he gets not one, but 2 lawyers. And they are 2 of the best lawyers in America. Edmund Randolph and William Wirt. Now, William Wirt was a lawyer who was a judge with Wythe on the state chancery court. They were friends. He had worked in the state legislature with George Wythe, a very close guy. He admired George Wythe. Why would he defend his killer? Wirt was an unhappy guy. He wasn't getting very well in the legal profession. He was in his mid-30s. And he wanted desperately to be famous. And he saw if he could get some killer off the hook that nobody thought he could get off the hook, he could do that. Second, he was under a lot of pressure from his wife. His wife grew up in Richmond and loved him. They had moved to Norfolk to pursue his legal career. She hated it. She was begging him to go back to Richmond. Then he had this idea. His friends went to Kentucky and made a lot of money. So he tells his wife, let's go to Kentucky, I'll make a lot of money. And she's in tears, so I want to go home to Richmond where my friends are. Then he gets a visit by his father-in-law. His father-in-law says, tell you what, if you go to Kentucky with my wife, who I'll never see again, I'll give you nothing, I won't loan you any money, I'll tell everybody in Kentucky and the banks there you're a bad risk. I'll offer you nothing. But if you move to Richmond, I'll buy you a house, and I'll give you all the land around the house, and introduce you to everybody I know. Wirt thought about this for about 4 seconds, and they moved to Richmond. Now, he also knew there was a legal bombshell here that he knew about this case that nobody else knew. He volunteers to try and defend the kid. The other lawyer is Edmund Randolph. Randolph had a storied career, as you know, here in Virginia. Mayor of Williamsburg, governor. He was Secretary of State for George Washington, Attorney General. But he had trouble. He was involved in a scandal when he was Secretary of State. He had to resign office in disgrace. A year later, he's caught in a second scandal from this place in today's money, $30 or $40 million of government money. Nobody knew where it went. And he had to get back into the legal field to make the money to pay back his $30 million. And he needed a hot case where he could get a killer off the hook that nobody expected. And that was this case. Those are the doctors from before that I talked about. They do an autopsy. Wythe insisted on an autopsy. They get the dream team doctors to do the autopsy. Now, autopsies were a big thing in that era. A lot of people did autopsies. You studied them in medical school. You cut a person in a Y position, opened up their body, took organs out, and examined them. There had been 40 or 50 textbooks written about how to do an autopsy. All the top journals in the country had stories on how to do an autopsy. There were stories on how to do an autopsy investigation in a homicide case. What to look for, what organs to take out, what to examine. These 3 guys are the best. They did the autopsy. They go to court with the autopsy results. We're not sure. Everybody thought it was arsenic, but the clerk says, I think it was stomach bile. I don't think it was arsenic. I'm the world's leading authority on stomach bile. He had 3 pounds of bile in his stomach. The bile killed him. The second Dr. McCall gets up there, who's the clerk's friend, and says, yeah, I mean, he said it was bile. I think it was bile too. I don't think it was arsenic. The third doctor backs them up. Yeah, we did a thorough autopsy. It wasn't arsenic. It was stomach bile. It could have been arsenic, but it probably wasn't. Well, the jury is sitting there, oh my God, these 3 guys say it wasn't arsenic. Maybe it wasn't. They know, they're the experts. Doesn't matter, right? Because as I've been telling you here, we have an eyewitness, Lydia Broadnax. She saw the kid pour the coffee into the kettle. She saw him, she can finger him. Called her to the stand, the next day we'll hang him. Lydia Broadnax is black. Under Virginia's laws, black people cannot testify. They cannot testify against white people in a court case. Anything she said to other people cannot be repeated in the court case because she's black. And it's hearsay. She couldn't take the stand. Phoebe, the slave girl that saw the arsenic flying over the wall, she can't testify. She's black. Anything she said can't go into court because she's black. The 2 carpenters that talked to him and saw him making the arsenic, same thing. They're African Americans. They can't testify. So what's the jury left with? The doctors say we don't think it was arson. There's no eyewitness account. None of these other people can testify. Given that, given the rules that you have to be without a shadow of a doubt certain somebody's guilty, how many people here, given that, would find him guilty? Ah, well, all right. Yeah, jury did the same thing. An hour later, the jury came in, not guilty. They acquitted him. Doesn't matter. We'll get him on forgery. He forged 7 banknotes to the Bank of Virginia. All of them identified his signature, trying to emulate George Wythe. George Wythe came down to the bank himself and said they're forgeries. It's an open and shut case. Just like juries today. Just like juries today. If we can't get somebody in a big charge, we'll nail them on a small charge. We'll do a couple years. Justice is done. So they started the forgery case. All right, now given the evidence, how many people here think he was guilty of forgery? No, okay, right, all the evidence there. There was no forgery trial. William Warren's attorney stood up and said he didn't violate the forgery law. When the forgery law was written, it specifically said forgery in private papers, not government documents. So if you forged a letter to her, that's a crime. But there was nothing involving banks, because there were no banks in Virginia in the 1770s when these laws were rewritten. The kid got off the hook. He beat all the charges. His lawyers then took him aside after trial and said, get out of town. Somebody's going to get you to get out of town. Now, he fled to Tennessee, and in Tennessee, a couple of years later, he was charged with horse stealing. And did a couple of years for horse stealing. But he didn't get anything at all involved with the murder here. Now, over the years, you've got to consider this. Why did he get off? He had 2 lawyers. Word leads this doctor down this garden path, testifying that it wasn't arsenic, that it was stomach bile. He wasn't sure, he didn't think, etc., etc. Carefully engineered questions to hook the jury. That's because Wirt knew months before the governor of Virginia told him that Dr. McClure, who did the autopsy, unethically blabbed the autopsy results, the uncertainty, to the governor. The governor then told Wirt, the defense attorney. Why? Wirt was his brother-in-law. He knew. That's how he helped get the kid off the hook. Number 2, juries are always instructed to be lenient in homicide cases. The law said that. Who wrote that law? George Wythe. Slaves were not allowed to testify against white people in Virginia in those years. Who wrote that law? George Wythe. George Wythe helped to exonerate his own murderers. Now, over the years, though, the kid, of course, has faded into memory. George Wythe has not. Now, I mentioned it before that all of you know who George Wythe was because you're all from Virginia. But everybody in the country has always known who George Wythe was because at some time in your life, when you're a kid or you're in school or you're visiting a museum or sometime, you see a copy of the greatest document ever written, the Declaration of Independence. And right down at the bottom, bold letters, it says George Wythe, signer. Thank you very much.
Bruce is available to answer your questions, but first I'd like to introduce Linda Shakulin, Linda is the honorary regent of the Chancellor Wythe Chapter National Daughters of the American Revolution. She's a former history teacher at Highland Springs High School and is currently the local chair for the 114th State DAR Conference to be held in Richmond in March 2010. And she has a special award to present.
Would the members of the Daughters of the American Revolution please stand and be recognized? And we have several members of the Chancellor Wythe Society today, too. Thank you. Like the founders of our country, you have inspired and enlightened us about a man who has, for too long been forgotten, but whose contributions to Virginia and the nation were immeasurable. On behalf of the Chancellor Wythe Chapter, Daughters of the American Revolution, we present to you this certificate of award for I Am Murdered, and we hope you continue to write about the colonial era and the people who built this great foundation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bruce is available to sign copies of his books at a reception following this. I'd like to thank the Chancellor Wythe Chapter, DAR, the Friends of the State Archives, and the Library of Virginia Foundation for their support of this presentation and the reception today. Thanks also to my colleagues here at the library and archivists at other institutions in Richmond for the events they have worked hard to organize during Archives Month. For those of you who have signed up for a behind-the-scenes tour of the archives, those tours will begin after the book signing, and the staff will meet you in the lobby. Bruce, if you want to take questions, and then we'll adjourn and let you...
Take some questions for 10 or 15 minutes, but I'm not taking any questions about the defeat of my beloved New York Yankees last night. Sorry. Oh, the question was, did the kid get any of the inheritance? No, before he died, Wythe changed his will and wrote him out of it. Yeah, so he didn't get a nickel out of it. No. And, yeah.
Do you know what the address was of that Fushi house that was so large that the Bank of Virginia?
I don't. It was in Center City, but I don't know what the address was.
Is the Fushi, the name still exists?
The street is named after it.
Okay.
Right. These are, the money went to George Wythe's family, with Michael Brown dead also. All the money went to his family through his sister's side of the family. Lydia's house was paid off, and Lydia did not die, she lived. And the poison almost destroyed her eyesight. Her doctor's bills for the rest of her life and the cost of all her classes for the rest of her life were paid for by President Jefferson, who was a close friend of hers. Sorry, yeah, I'm sorry.
Did Lydia Bronex keep a diary at all?
No.
Okay, because apparently there were some black slaves and free people whose diaries and account books had been used in court cases because they were legal documents of some sort or another, so that book would be allowed to testify.
No, she didn't have that. There were people who wrote about her, but no, she didn't leave any diaries or letters. Or if she did, they've never been saved. Right?
We did, the prosecutor was.
Oh, the prosecutor was a guy named Philip Norborn Nicholas. He was very interested in this case because he was a close friend of George Wythe's, and along with George Wythe was a member of the committee to elect and then re-elect their friend, President Jefferson. Nicholas was considered one of the real tough guy prosecutors. Later became a director of several different national banks. Sorry.
So, we had city then, was there a certain section of the city that was worse? I mean, obviously, you would have been able to get across, but dark areas, or where was all this really bad stuff going on?
It was down the bottom of the hill along the river at the dock areas, and then farther east of here there was a dock area called Rocket's Landing. A lot of trouble at Rocket's Landing. But the thing though is, if you live, Richmond physically, even today, is not a big place. So if you lived up here on top of the hill, for you to walk down to the river and then over to where the gambling employees were, is a 5-minute walk. You know, it's not a long journey to get down there. And for the people who were drunks in town, it was easy to get home just walking back and forth home. Ma'am.
Who was the author of the book that hit you on the head?
It wasn't a book, it was 2 20-page articles from the College of William and Mary Journal. One of the authors was head of the Thomas Jefferson papers at Princeton, and I don't remember the name of the other. And I used both of those as source material in my book. I got interested in it because those articles were written in 1955, when there wasn't much known about forensics. But today, all of us, are awash in forensics because of the television shows, CSI. I think there's a statistic that at some point in the week, an American is watching every American is watching one of the 3 different CSI shows on television.
Oh, really?
Yeah, or the 19 Law and Order shows. No, I mean, seriously, you look at television today, you talk about crime. I mean, I have FiOS TV. Anybody here have FiOS TV? All right, we get 700 channels, and nothing's on. But on FiOS TV, there are 2 24-hour-a-day crime networks. The ID network and some other network. The Law and Order shows are repeated endlessly. There's marathons of Law and Order, CSI, and this and that. There's all this crime on TV. Other questions?
So I think it was really arsenic, do you know for sure?
Yep, it was arsenic. All the investigation showed it was arsenic. There's no doubt about it. One other thing too, glad you brought that up. Part of the problem here was the courts, because at that time it was a well-known fact that if you died of arsenic, they could dig up your body later. The gases that your body lets go after you die, combining with arsenic in your system, would create large yellow splotches on your stomach lining. They could have done that and found arsenic too, but they chose not to do that. Why did these famous doctors botch the autopsy? Well, they messed it up. Why did they do that? My thinking, they were spending so much time being good politicians, they forgot how to be good doctors. Somebody else had their
Well,
hand.
could it have been something to do with that one guy had written that book about stomach bile?
Yep.
He's like leaning that way?
Dr. McClure wrote the book on stomach bile. Dr. McClure, he was an egomaniacal fanatic. On his tombstone, he's buried here in Richmond. Take a look at his tombstone. Basically, it says, "I'm the greatest human being that ever lived." And he backs it up with evidence. He once called anybody that criticized him a yahoo. Now, this is the best doctor in the country, right? Here are some of his beliefs. Christians can never get sick. Only immoral people get sick. 2, if you get sick in the summertime when it's hot, the cure is to drink a lot of wine. Now, you're going to die, but you're going to die happy. Another famous thing in that era was if you had, they would bleed you. They thought you had bad blood. But they just bled you, the bad blood would come out, and you'd be okay. And then they would do that, and you would bleed to death. They had a lot of crazy medical practices. Only 13% of all doctors in America had any training at all in that era. And they give you these crazy herbal remedies to try and heal you when you got sick. One was they mix up tar you put on your roof, you mix it up with water, and you give it to somebody who has asthma. Another one, you take corns off of horses' feet, and you ground up the corns, and you pour them into a bottle of French wine, and drink the wine. And if they didn't get better, the doctor would say, well, what French wine did you use? Well, this one. You used the wrong one. It's crazy things that went on. Other questions? Yes?
Did they bleed with?
No.
They didn't.
No, they did not. No, they didn't do that. The other thing, too, was they were so sure that you had to die within 4 days. That's why they didn't think it was arsenic. Not taking into account the fact that if you poison somebody, it takes old people longer to die than it does young people. It takes thinner people a longer time to die. Everybody's body metabolism with poisons reacts differently. And there were many cases in that era, all of which they could have read about, of people who had been poisoned and lived several weeks later before dying, or people who did not die even though they were poisoned. And those doctors didn't know that. Oh, yes?
You mentioned that all 3 of them were trained in Edinburgh.
Yes.
Did the School of Medicine in Edinburgh believe most of these mythical things?
They did. They did. In Edinburgh, they developed this theater where you do autopsies of a body down here. The big round theater where students would sit at it and look down. The famous thing about that, if you ever saw the Seinfeld episode, where Kramer and Seinfeld are sitting in the theater watching down, and Kramer is playing with his bubble gum, and it goes into the body. You gotta catch that one. But the University of Edinburgh was so respected that if anybody graduated from there, they knew everything. The American Medical College, when they all first started in the 18th century, duplicated all the curriculum from the University of Edinburgh. And when McClure was in Edinburgh, the deans there, when he graduated, they thought so highly of him. The professors didn't give him letters of recommendation. The deans did. And they would tell people, wow, this is the guy. Other questions?
Where did he die? Where did he die?
He died in bed, in his home,
Here in
here in Richmond, at 15th Gray Street. Yeah, lingered there for 2 weeks. Sorry.
Is Jefferson ever published an opinion of the case?
Jefferson was in communication with the mayor of Richmond, who told him all the details of the case, and Jefferson concluded that his friend had been murdered. Interestingly enough, Wythe was buried a few days after he died. Transportation of letters in that era was very slow, so the president did not find out that Wythe had died until after he was actually buried. And said that if he had only known that they were going to hold the funeral, he, the president, would have led the funeral procession. Any other questions? Yes. Okay, last question.
Did he suspect his nephew of poisoning him? Is that why he said he'd been murdered? He didn't
Yes.
file?
Yes, Lydia told him the nephew had poisoned him. And he had all the symptoms of being poisoned. And he told all of his doctors that and all of his friends that. He was certain he had been poisoned. So much so that he told his doctors, when I die, cut me. His words were, cut me to do an autopsy to prove that he had been poisoned. Okay, the only other thing I want to tell you, just in going away, tonight, Yankees 11, Phillies 2.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Before we adjourn to the book sale and signing and reception, we have one more item. Many of you may know that Conley Edwards here is retiring at the end of this week after 35 years of service at the library. And I'm Catherine O'Brien, Virginia Caucus representative for MARAC, which is the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference. And on behalf of MARAC, I would like to take this opportunity to personally thank Conley for his years of service at the Library of Virginia and for his support of Virginia Archives Month. Since it began in 2002, Conley has been a generous supporter of Virginia Archives Month, which celebrates Virginia archives and archivists and the important work they do. Thank you, Conley. Conley has also been active in the National Council of State Archivists, serving as president of the board from 2000 to 2008. It is my pleasure now, on behalf of Patricia Michaelis, president of the Council of State Archives, to present Conley with a resolution honoring him and his service to the archives profession. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read the resolution. That's right. Whereas Conley Edwards served as the 5th president of the Council of State Archives and served with energy and distinction on the board for 6 years, and whereas Conley's leadership as vice president and president, the council has worked to ensure that our nation's historical records are valued, preserved, and widely used, and whereas during his tenure, Conley brought numerous projects to successful conclusions for the council, while at the same time launching new initiatives. And whereas Conley is retiring from his 35-year career at the Library of Virginia, and whereas Conley has always maintained unfailing courtesy to his fellow state archivists and colleagues, befitting his stature as a proper Virginia gentleman, and whereas his gentlemanly ways have served him well during his excellent adventure with fellow COSA board member Carl Niederer to establish working relationships with national organizations sharing common interests with the council, and which have grown and prospered in the years since, and during his shenanigans in our nation's capital. And whereas the Southern gentleman has unveiled from time to time an unexpected and much appreciated sense of humor and theatrical comedy, from recounting his part in the rescue of governor's records on a dark and stormy night, to his single-handed transformation of a COSA business meeting to a revivalist tent without props. And whereas Conley has been and will continue to be an articulate voice and a persuasive and able advocate for archives, and whereas he has given enthusiastic and articulate support to the Preserving the American Historical Record Initiative, and whereas he joined the staff of the Library of Virginia
then the Virginia State Library, on August 1st, 1974, as a reference archivist after completing his graduate history degree at the University of Richmond. And whereas in the 35 years since, he has consistently demonstrated individual dedication to the best qualities of the profession, and whereas he was named Virginia's 5th state archivist in 1996 and subsequently shepherded the collections through a massive and historic move, and whereas Conley has offered his enthusiastic support to the celebration of Archives Month in Virginia for the past 8 years, helping to promote the value of archives and the importance of archivists, and whereas his pride in his work, spirit of cooperation, and positive attitude are an inspiration to his colleagues in the archival profession. Whereas Conley has served as coordinator of the Virginia State Historical Records Advisory Board since 1996, facilitating grants totaling nearly $351,000 for half a dozen projects and receiving several administrative grants. These grants help preserve the story of the Commonwealth and its citizens for future generations. Whereas as Shrab's coordinator, Conley works with record keepers throughout Virginia at local historical societies, archival institutions, museums, and other organizations to save endangered records, preserve them, and make them available for all researchers. Ultimately, these records help illuminate the history of the Commonwealth. Whereas Conley has consistently and without hesitation offered his colleagues the invaluable benefit of his time and expertise. Whereas Conley leads by example as an archivist who believes wholeheartedly in his work and is committed to the importance of the documentary record. And whereas Conley has taught us that the story of the past is told one voice at a time in the archives, now, therefore, be it resolved by the Council of State Archivists that we express our deep gratitude and respect to Conley Edwards for his service to the Council and to the state and territorial archives we represent, and to the people of the United States whose rich history we hold in trust. And be it further resolved that the Council recognizes Conley's 35 years of service to the profession as a whole and to his institution, where he worked in a variety of capacities before his appointment as state archivist. Be it finally resolved that we recognize Conley's wisdom and insight, the high level of his personal and professional commitment, the uncounted hours he has dedicated to preserving the rich documentary heritage of Virginia and the nation as a whole, and express to him the lasting respect and friendship we will always hold for him.
I told you we'd add 5 more minutes.
You're right. And I have lost my sheet of paper here, but I wanted to introduce Wayne Dementi. Is he here? Wayne is a local writer and publisher about Richmond history, and he's been a member of SHRAB, the State Historic Records Advisory Board, since 2003, and he has something he would like to present.
Thank you, Catherine. Kindly, are we succeeding in making this a surprise?
Yes, indeed.
Good. Hey, there are, I think, 3 more of your board members here today, too. Francis Pollard. Francis, come on up here, Francis, from the Virginia Historical Society. Susan Riggs. Susan, come on up here, Susan, from William and Mary. And Amy Morocco. Is Amy here? Come on, Amy. We wanted to join today, kindly, in congratulating you on your wonderful career and all the support you've lent to us as board members in the SHRAB. It has been a delightful journey for all of us. We wanted to add to the many, many, many well wishes and congratulatory remarks being brought your way this week. But we also thought it would just be kind of fun to tell these folks a little bit about some of the nuances we picked up. We followed with great admiration your ability to organize an agenda and marshal us to this $350,000 worth of grants we've gotten over the years. But we've also noted that at 10 o'clock every morning, while the rest of us are drinking coffee, you're drinking Coke. We wanted to present you with an honorary 6-pack.
For you, you're worth every drop of it.
Kindly has always done a wonderful job in organizing the agenda for our meetings that we've had everywhere, and the agenda is always very, very purposeful and very well thought out. But the other thing we've learned that Kindly does when he organizes these agendas is pay particular attention to the dessert menu at lunch. And so kindly, we understand another good development that has occurred here, that you're going to stay with us as a member of our committee. And so we are empowering you with the responsibility for picnic lunch. And we want to give you your kindly dessert menu for safekeeping. Oh, thank you. Bring it back to see if she's going to get some kindly dessert menu.
It's mainly chocolate.
Thank you. As you can tell, we've had a lot of fun with Conley. He's been a wonderful leader, and we've admired everything that you've done through all this. But we do have a couple of real ones. So, Kansas, take his coat, sir. Let's see. The first one I'm delighted to present to you is a representation of what you've accomplished through the years in the form of this presentation. And so you all can see it. It's the Governor of Virginia and the Library Board cordially invite you to attend the dedication of the new State Library building. Kind of was very much a part of that, and it shows the old building and the new building. The old building is a fairly old photo. I think, Conley, you're not in this picture, but so we wanted to present this to you. And one more. We have a particular letter of congratulations that I would like to share. Dear Mr. Edwards, on behalf of the citizens of the Commonwealth of Virginia, I am pleased to congratulate you on your retirement following 35 years of dedicated service with the Library of Virginia. I commend you for your distinguished service and your remarkable career with the Library of Virginia. Through your work with the State Historical Records Advisory Board, you have worked tirelessly to preserve and protect Virginia's valuable treasures. Your diligent stewardship of key historical records enables current and future generations to learn from the accomplishments and challenges we have faced. I commend you for your tireless service to the Commonwealth. I have no doubt that you will be greatly missed, except you're going to stay around on the committee. On behalf of your colleagues and all Virginians, I want to thank you for your distinguished service. With wishes for a healthy, rewarding, and enjoyable retirement, sincerely, Timothy M. Kane. We have enjoyed Conley's professional relationship with us, and also your friendship, which we cherish tremendously, and we're looking forward to that continuing. Thank you, Conley. Let's give Conley a big hand.
Please join Bruce outside. And there's one more thing.
We're gonna the book signing is going to be across the lobby. One last thing, we do have. Hopefully, you guys got a chance to put your name in for the drawing of what is actually the last copy of the book we have today. Dr. Chadwick, would you do us the honor of drawing the name? All right, Deanna Baker, are you still here? Deanna Baker, there you go. Congratulations. All right. Please enjoy the reception, and Dr. Chadwick will be across the lobby.